Thank you. Welcome, everyone. This is Youssef Sharif. I'm the head of Columbia Global Centers Tunis. We're doing this webinar in partnership with Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, and we have with us two leading Ottoman experts and historians who will talk to us about the plague in Ottoman times and how Ottomans reacted to the plague in these times. Actually, this is of actuality, and I pass the floor now to my colleague Ipek Shemtaha from Istanbul. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Yusuf. I'd like to extend also a warm welcome from Columbia's Global Center in Istanbul. We're excited to bring you this collaborative program featuring Nükhet Varlık and Tunç. Nükhet Varlık is from Rutgers University, Newark, and the University of South Carolina, and Tunç is with Columbia University. Nükhet is a historian of the Ottoman Empire working on disease, medicine, and public health. She's the author of Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, the Ottoman Experience, 1347 to 1600. Her new book project is The Empire, Ecology, and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic, which examines over 500 years of Ottoman plague experience in a global ecological context. Tunç is a historian of the Ottoman Empire whose research and records of publication revolve around questions about the history of science and divination, perceptions of time, and manuscript culture in the early modern era. He's currently working on his first book titled Masters of Time, Astrologers and Scientific Experience at the Early Modern Ottoman Court. He is also a member of the Faculty Advisory Committee of the Istanbul Center. He is also one of the collaborators of the international research project, Geographies and Histories of the Ottoman Supernatural Tradition, for which we hosted a two-day seminar at our center in December. So welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have this collaborative webinar tonight. I will quickly pass the floor to Nükhet and to Tunç. But before that, I just wanted to say we're going to try to remain within our approximate 1 hour time frame. The first half of that time will be spent with Nükhet and Tunç in conversation. And then the second half will be taking in your questions. You can, if you haven't sent them via email, please make sure you type them into our Q&A section, which is at the bottom of the page. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Nükhet and Tunç. Welcome again. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, Ipek and Yusuf, for hosting us, albeit virtually, and for this very warm, welcoming remarks. And Nükhet, thank you so much for your time and for joining me today. And it's an absolute pleasure to get to speak with you on a topic in which you are the real expert. And so as Ipek has just mentioned, in the next 30 minutes or so, Nükhet and I will have a conversation about the Ottoman experiences of past plague pandemics and how this sort of historical knowledge is relevant and helpful to give a better context to what we've all been living in the past few months as our new normal in the age of coronavirus. So I'm going to start off by asking you a more personal kind of question, Nükhet. As a historian working on the past pandemics, primarily in the Ottoman context, what were your initial reactions when you first heard the news about the outbreak and when the WHO just declared it as a pandemic? And you also mentioned in your social media account a while ago that you unfortunately developed some of the symptoms of COVID-19, but thankfully everything is good now, so you fully got through it. So I really wondered, I would like to hear more about your personal reflections as both a plague historian and as somebody who experienced this COVID-19 disease at first hand.
Okay, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for the organization. So I'll start with the question that you mentioned, WHO, announced it as a pandemic, and what was my response? Well, I announced it as a pandemic before WHO did, because, in my own way, at least in my own class, because WHO was absolutely extremely late in doing so, as many of us know, because we had already all the signs of a global pandemic going on even before WHO did. I think they did it around March 11th, 12th,
Yeah.
sometime around that time. So the reason actually I had an opportunity to watch this pandemic very closely is that this spring semester I was teaching a course on plague and pandemics. So it was a good opportunity for me to think about this global pandemic with my students, and in a way, a very rare opportunity for a historian of pandemic to be able to watch something unfold very closely. And in fact, Johns Hopkins University's database was set up very early on, along with other digital tracking, information tracking sources, and with GIS information, we were able to see the numbers, since it's very early on. And so, as I said, it was a very interesting and kind of learning experience for me to see how a global pandemic takes place in real time, right? And of course, this has implications to think about history and historical knowledge about pandemics, even though our knowledge is, of course, less than perfect when it comes to historical sources. There is lacunae in our information, but it is possible to think about the broad parameters of the spread of pandemics and how they unfold in historical time periods using the information we have right now. One of the very interesting parallels or similarities, at least for my purposes, was to see the initial slow but invisible spread of the disease, in which, until basically mid-March, at least, in the US, but also many purposes, many other places, including Turkey, many countries did not really acknowledge the presence of the disease or heavy circulation of the disease, community spread in their own regions until that time. And we are left with this feeling that, oh, it suddenly exploded in the second half of March, right? Which is, now we understand it was not the case, because it was already in the process of spreading, perhaps since January, even perhaps earlier. Globally. So in that context, I think it is important to think of the invisibility of the spread of disease, which our historical sources sometimes fail to mention. But again, like, even though we have much better, technologies and possibilities to track information now, even we were not able to see. So it kind of, makes us think about the disease as an entity, but our knowledge about the disease, as like two different, or like the tension between the two, which I think is an important question to think about. But as a historian, of course, and also as someone who experienced the infection, for me, the ultimate context in which to make meaning of this is to think that, well, as human beings, we've had this experience for a long time, right? When you look at, long history of humanity, we've always experienced diseases, pandemics, unfortunate climate events, or other environmental crises. And perhaps in the last 100 or 150 years, we haven't really forgotten it, but, of historians, we are perhaps studying it, but like in terms of life experience, it's not, at least in developed worlds, or most of the developed and developing countries, this is not in the immediate repertoire of personal biological experiences, right? I mean, but when you compare it to, again, long history of humanity, we are in a very unusual age in which life expectancy has been at least double of what we have before the 19th century. Infant mortality has been reduced. Life expectancy increased. Infectious diseases are less of a problem. So all of these kind of improvements in public health and sanitation kind of give us the illusion that we live in a safe world, that we're kind of isolated or free or immune from the threats, from the biological and environmental threats of this world, which is perhaps an illusion. And now we're coming to terms with this reality. Well, at least that's how I see it. Yeah.
There is this funny thing, I mean, about the use of the word unprecedented, which has spiked in the past few months thanks to the coronavirus crisis. But as you rightfully said, I mean, this is not entirely unprecedented. I mean, we had so many examples of pandemics, diseases, I mean, contagious infections, and so on and so forth. But most of these diseases were studied in the historical scholarship with a particular European focus. I mean, the famous story of the Black Death, the second plague pandemic, has been studied in a narrow European context. But your work, and I would like to show all our listeners at least the title, the cover page of your book. Unfortunately, my copy of your book is in the office, to which I don't have access right now. But your work just expanded the scope of the historical scholarship. So what would you like to say about this heavy Eurocentric approach to studying plague and similar pandemics? And what can the Ottoman experiences of plague contribute to these stories?
Right. I mean, let's start with the question of unprecedented, whether this pandemic is unprecedented or not. It's not. It's unprecedented in recent history or recent memory, but not unprecedented at all. What makes it, what kind of shapes the discussion, or how the discussion about the pandemic changed over time, really has to do with when it arrived to Europe and North America. I think we've all observed that the tone and the quality and the context of the discussion, changed, which is very relevant in thinking about past pandemics, right? When we think about the late medieval and early modern period, pandemics really matter for historians as much as it involves Europe. And later on, North America, but of course that is something that takes us to the context of modern history and mostly the third pandemic. But as long as the second pandemic is concerned, and by second pandemic, I mean the 14th century Black Death, a global pandemic of plague, but it's recurrent outbreaks that continued until the 19th and early 20th century in some places. So 500 to 600 years of repeated plague outbreaks. But how were these outbreaks studied, and how do we talk about them? Again, to a very large extent, it's a Eurocentric discussion. It is something that is mainly studied by historians of Europe. It is something that is discussed mainly in the context of Europe, almost creating this illusion that it is something that only affected Europe, which is, which cannot be far from truth. And we know for a fact that Black Death pandemic and its recurrent outbreaks affected to a very large portion of the Afro-Eurasian world, are the classic knowledge of the spatial extent of the second pandemic, starting with the Black Death. Black Death has been like Europe, maybe the Mediterranean world, North Africa, perhaps parts of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. But now we're learning that actually it was a lot larger than this, Western portion of Eurasia. Now we have evidence that Black Death may have affected sub-Saharan Africa. Again, this is not something that we know from historical sources, but we're learning this from archaeological evidence. There is also new evidence coming in about the presence of the Black Death. In fact, its origins in Central Asia. So as we learn about new data, historical, archaeological, genetics, and otherwise, we are trying to rethink about the spatial extent of the second pandemic. But why does this matter, and why is it important to think about the experiences of different regions, right? Like, why is it important to diversify this picture? Why is it important to extend it outside of Europe? It is extremely important because with every piece that you put into this puzzle, or the new pieces of information coming in, we can rethink the dynamics of the circulation of disease, its effects, and in fact, new information coming in makes us question about even our basic tenets about the kinds of knowledge that we thought we knew. One example, of course, very relevant to Ottoman history, before I started working on this question about plague circulation in the Mediterranean world, studying more closely the Ottoman sources, the general impression among the scholarly community, among the historians especially, the general impression was that, well, in fact, let's say the convention was that plague always traveled from the Ottoman Empire to Europe. Right? But when you read the sources, when you take into consideration the Ottoman sources and look into this, the circulation of disease very closely, as I did in my research, I actually saw that convention was not really based on historical data. I mean, it was mostly based on the observations of European observers of the Ottoman Empire coming back to Europe and reporting that plague was coming from the Ottoman Empire at the time. But when you look at the Ottoman sources, well, there are different narratives going around. So it's not necessarily an east to west transmission of disease, but there is, a more complex pattern of transmission at play. So I guess all I'm trying to say is when you examine the plague experiences of different regions, then you can question what we thought we knew, and in fact challenge some of the previous knowledge.
Let's talk a bit more about the peculiar or some common Ottoman experiences of the recurrent plague outbreaks. I mean, one of the arguments you make in your work is that Ottoman society and state did transform the disease as much as the disease transformed the Ottoman state and society. Could you just tell a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Right. Again, I think it is an established idea among historians since the 70s, since, of course, the work of William McNeil has been very influential about the idea that, disease is a force in history shaping societies. And I think no one will dispute that idea today. It's a well-established historical notion now. But I think what we did not pay enough attention to was, yes, diseases transform societies, but also societies transform diseases, right? I mean, with the dynamic nature of societies, we should also think about how societies shape and transform diseases as biological entities, but also social constructs. So I think it's important to think about the dynamic between disease and society. And in the particular Ottoman case, of course, you know, there is the additional challenge, especially for the time period that I was studying at. Well, with respect to Ottoman society, late medieval and early modern period, as you know very well, we're talking about a very series of fast changes in society, not only for the geographic expansion of the empire, but also in terms of its urbanization, in terms of like new structures being built in the empire itself, you know, in the empire formation, in the emergence of an empire, but at the same time with respect to you know, changes in the climate, changes in the environment, changes in the way people created new institutions and new knowledge. So there is something that is very dynamic. So we cannot treat this as a static entity. And so let's think about how this change affected the disease. Again, that was one of the kind of departure points for my argument that, well, we observe the emergence of an empire, especially in the 16th century. We see the full, you know, articulation of this imperial ideology and identity and its institutional manifestation. Well, how did this affect the disease? In my research, I saw that the expansion of the empire basically reinforced the expansion of the disease and made it more frequent in several locations of the empire. So I guess what I really want to emphasize is that it's important to think of disease and societies in a dialectic and a very close relationship with each other.
And how did the Ottoman state handle the problem of the disease? And as you said, I mean, the outbreaks were pretty frequent. Every 10 years or so, there was another major outbreak in both the capital and other provinces of the empire. How did the imperial center react to these outbreaks? Were there any particular measures they tried to implement in order to not maybe contain the disease, as it wasn't possible, but to alleviate the level of fatality rates or else?
Right. I mean, that's a better way of putting it. Like, we're not talking about success over disease in the sense that we want to think ourselves like as a fight with disease. In fact, you know, I see these metaphors of like disease, the virus as the enemy now. I mean, we see it on the media, and you know, is it a struggle? Is it a fight? Did past societies, you know, understand this as a struggle in the way we think about it? Well, I don't find this conceptual structure very helpful. In the sense that I think there's a modern bias there, right? Pre-modern context.
We can't really expect, yeah.
Right, made them more attuned to these kinds of disaster with a kind of like, perhaps a stoic acceptance, if not fatalism, right? That this is a fact of nature, this is a fact of life, right? Especially in the case of plague, and perhaps we can, you know, apply this same idea to a certain extent to other phenomena. We are talking about a disease that is recurring at least every decade, right? Even perhaps in certain contexts more frequently, which means that you have personal experience about it. You know it's going to come back. You know that there is a working knowledge within the society, you know, not necessarily scholarly medical knowledge, but just like, you know, working knowledge based on experience and observation of individuals who had first-hand experience with disease that is being transmitted and circulated in society, right? So, you know, let's take that experience seriously, right? That recurrence. But at the same time, of course, you know, scholars were discussing this problem. There are legal and medical discussions about it, and also the state in terms of the measures it wanted to implement, and in terms of its kind of struggle to keep up with the disease, or perhaps contain, mitigate, and whatnot. There was an effort to understanding and developing a knowledge about it. So so in that sense, of course, they tried to alleviate some of the impact, but they did this in the way that they thought would be helpful to alleviate those responses, the effects of the disease. By which I mean, it's really, we need to keep to account how did they understand the disease, because their response can only be understood in that context. And in fact, one of the main medical paradigms of the pre-modern world that is not limited to Ottoman case was that diseases, especially epidemic diseases, were caused by bad air, contamination in the air, fetid air, and bad smell. So the idea of the miasma, again, this is something that comes from ancient Greco-Roman medicine that was developed in classical Islamic medicine that Ottoman medicine was an heir to, and the same idea is also in Europe and other parts of the Mediterranean world during the late medieval and early modern period. So the idea is that there are invisible miasmas, invisible vapors and bad smells in the air, and this is something that causes disease. Well, if you think that it's bad air that is causing disease, what do? You kind of, do what you can to clear and to clean the air, right? So when we look at most of the administrative regulations that kind of, we see during times of plague, it is mostly focused on clean air, right? One typical struggle of this process is to contain and control dead bodies during times of plague, because it was believed that dead bodies could emanate the miasma and contaminate the air. So quick burial and burial outside of the cities is this one manifestation of this idea of thinking about cleaning the air and protecting the living, right? If you want to make it, provide clean air for the living during times of plague, you have to take the dead bodies outside of city walls. Similarly, clean water was a source of concern, and again, Istanbul, of course, more visibly, but also in other urban areas of the city, providing clean water resources to big cities, especially, was problem, was a source of concern. But at times of plague, we see that there is a heightened anxiety about punishing those that were believed to contaminating water resources and whatnot. So clean air, clean water were thought of like essential components of healthy living. So most of the administrative efforts of the state kind of focused on those areas.
And you also mentioned that there was knowledge produced about the disease and possible ways to treat it, circulated through different channels. And we can make another blatant comparison between the late medieval and early modern Ottoman period and what we are living today. I mean, every day we have press conferences delivered by political authorities surrounding themselves with a team of medical experts. I would like to hear about these experts in the late medieval and early modern era. But who were those experts whose advice might have been demanded by both the political authorities and the broader public? Were there any particular groups offering that kind of advice to the rulers, the ruling elites, and the general public?
Well, there is definitely a sense in which there a body of knowledge specific to plague was developing throughout the course of the 15th and 16th centuries and onwards, of course. So when you look at the emergence of expertise on plague, which I found very interesting to kind of trace how and kind of developed and was built in the Ottoman Empire, and of course, it has its precedence from pre-Ottoman period, especially Mamluk scholarly sources played an important influence, but also other Eastern influences, as during the Black Death and in the aftermath of it, we see that scholarly knowledge in the Islamic world was being, articulated. So the Ottomans were heir to some of the knowledge that already existed, but they also revised and expanded on this body of knowledge. And in fact, in the 16th century, we also see that they are kind of diverging from some of the established conventions in the earlier Islamic wisdom body of knowledge about plague. So who were these experts, and how did this body of knowledge develop, and what's the role of patronage in it? And I think in this sense, we don't see something that is peculiar to the case of plague or medicine that we don't see in other areas of natural sciences. And I think there are similarities in the sense that, well, there's a very practical problem at hand, right? Well, how do we understand plague? What do we do at times of plague? So there were some works clearly commissioned by members of the elite, but also others, of course, seeking patronage and producing sources. And again, during this time period, I think it's very important to pay attention to the emergence of this new genre, like plague treatises. Interestingly enough, we see plague treatises in Europe, in the Ottoman Empire, of course, in different parts of the Islamic world at the same time. But it's a separate genre, right? Why are they talking about plague not in like medical works, but in its own genre, right? I think it will be a good project.
Who were writing those treatises, if you don't mind?
Right. There is, I think, a very diverse group of individuals who produce those sources. We would perhaps expect them to be all medical scholars. They're not. We have medical doctors writing sources, but also we have other members of the ulama, the religious scholars, mainly writing about legal aspects of plague, but also incorporating medical discussions into their work. So we have prominent religious scholars of the 16th century, for example, like Taşköprüzade, Ahmet Efendi, and we have Kemal Paşazade, so the chief jurisconsult of the empire. So prominent religious scholars composing works on the plague. At the same time, you have doctors, physicians. Interestingly enough, you also find plague in the discussions of mystics and Sufis, right? That's also another interesting part of this diverse group. Also, historians wrote about plague as well. So we have, I think, a very diverse group of individuals, composing these works.
I mean, aside from this immediate medical aspect of the disease, I mean, there is an important economic dimension, as we all experience today. I mean, jobs were lost, businesses were closed. There are strict measures implemented by governments to, again, help those who unfortunately lost their jobs. Was there a similar kind of awareness about the economic impact of these recurrent outbreaks in terms of production chain, or I mean, how was the impact of plague in the lives of artisans or those involved in trade and so on and so forth?
Right.
Do you know anything? Yeah.
Huge economic impact, and I think we're only now, starting to understand what an incredible strain and pressure this was for Ottoman history. Ottoman archival records, I guess, would be a good source to go to understand this, as we have a very large number of documents showing how businesses are affected. how tax collection is, of course, affected, how certain individuals, of course, and others kind of petitioning the state about their losses owing to plague. So we see a diverse group of individuals, being affected by the disease. And in the numbers, even the archival documents sometimes are very precise about giving us, the number of individuals who died in a certain location. The proportions are really astonishingly high. So, right, we need to rethink about, the whole tax collection process. And in fact, the 17th century crisis is also something that we need to think about, taking the impact of plague and desertification of many smaller settlements, especially disappearance of some villages during this period, especially in Anatolia, migration, and of course this when it is especially combined with the Little Ice Age and the Jelali rebellions and plague, we're really looking at a very grim picture. So economically speaking, yes, a major loss of tax revenue for the state, but also businesses and individuals affected. Yeah.
Let me continue with an even darker issue of death. I mean, the history of plague is, in a sense, history of death. And you said it was a very quotidian aspect of life. People, I mean, how did people conceive of such a fatal disease? I mean, what kind of notions of death were in circulation, expressed by individuals from different walks of life? I mean, do we know anything about the perceptions of death written by Ottoman individuals?
We do, and we have some literary sources, at least, that tell us about emotions of individuals, how they responded to this when they lost their loved ones, right? It makes me think of one of the earliest poems that we have about the Black Death in Anatolia by Shayat Hamza. He lost several of his children during the Black Death, right? And then he talks about, the agony of losing children, I mean, his children to plague. And the way he talks about it, to me, I found it very similar in the way he talks about his emotions to a Welsh poet who composed a poem just about the same time during the Black Death. Wow. And he lost several of his children to plague. And it would be interesting to make a cross cultural analysis of death and disease, but it was strikingly similar in the way it was discussed. But I mean, we have also other narrative descriptions of emotions of individuals who lost family members and loved ones to plague. I mean, it's of course extremely grim, but at the same time, there is a sense of I don't know how to put it without making the Ottoman society sound too fatalistic, but there is a sense of acceptance, but not resistance. So I, will have to find a way of formulating this because, I mean, simply because the European accounts are talking about the Ottoman individuals who kind of understood this as something that came from God. I think that part they got it, but they also interpret this as the society being, the Muslim society in general, being fatalistic, like not doing anything about the disease and just accepting it as God's order, but not responding to it. And that's the part that I have problem with, because we have clearly plenty of evidence to suggest that, of course they did what they could. And in a way, when you look at all the measures, that the state imposed and all the ways in which individuals tried to deal with disease things, ranging with all forms of experimental treatments, remedies, and all the medical effort. Well, it's about the same everywhere, right? I mean, Europeans were also doing similar things. So everyone responds within the repertoire of the methods available to them. And so, it would be ridiculous to think of this as a kind of fatalism that pushed people into inactivity and passivity in the face of this disease.
And there, as far as I remember, there was a big discussion whether one can flee from the plague or not, right? But that kind of discussion had also a kind of class dimension. I mean, not everybody had the chance back in the time to leave the space they were living in because they didn't have the necessary resources or the means, or they were kind of stuck in where they were residing. So it wasn't not unlike what we've been living now, right? Not all of us are lucky to stay at home. I mean, some of us have to go outside and keep working. So is there a kind of class dimension in all these discussions back in the medieval and early modern eras?
Right. Absolutely, there is, and in fact, as you pointed out, our present situation is a good reminder that some of us can stay home and others cannot, right? So there is always an economic and socioeconomic dimension built into this. And this is especially important because when you look at the discussions about whether it is legitimate to flee an outbreak of plague or not, and when this is discussed merely as or purely as a legal question. I mean, yes, it is a legal question, and we see the discussion of this debate, in a legal context. But there's also practical dimension in it. So yes, scholars were considering whether it is permissible according to Islamic law to flee an outbreak of plague or not. Some earlier Islamic scholars had ruled against it. We have examples of scholars who were more supportive of this idea, but also those who were against it. In the Ottoman case, especially in the 16th century, I see the divergence that I mentioned earlier on was basically in this direction. We see that the Ottoman religious scholars were kind of leaning toward the idea of making flight from plague cities, infested cities, permissible. In fact, Taşköprüzade and Ebu Suud, as religious scholars, they had rulings about, yes, it is permissible to flee an outbreak of plague as long as you are, fleeing with the purpose of, finding clean air and treatment, right? But it was not possible to leave a city for everyone at times of plague. I mean, especially we have evidence that the elite, the military, administrative, and religious elite of the empire had the means to do so, but not everyone, especially the urban poor, right? Those who had to stay in the cities and work could not flee. And so they died in disproportionately larger numbers. And again, what we see in the Ottoman Empire is not really peculiar to the Ottoman system. What I mean is, we see similar problems in European cities, for example, during the Black Death, in the aftermath of it. So usually you have, the elite members of the society having the means to escape a city during a plague, whereas you have lower classes that did not enjoy this privilege. In fact, fleeing from plague turned into a seasonal routine. In fact, a yearly routine for most European ambassadors and other European residents of Istanbul, as well as the Ottoman elite, that they would have a second residence outside of the city. And this is in fact the beginning of the Bosporus villages and residences along the coast of the Bosphorus and closer to the Black Sea region, just, staying away from cities. And this is not, again, only Istanbul. We have evidence of other Ottoman cities, like, within a distance of perhaps like 1 to 2 days travel distance. For that time, people would retreat to villages and the countryside, and to wait for until the end of the outbreak. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we saw the same thing here in the early days of the outbreak, people leaving cities, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have 15 more minutes, so maybe we should now turn to some of the questions raised by our listeners. So I'd like to remind our listeners to post their questions, if there are any, in the Q&A box. So let me read one question posed by Santosh Kumar Rai, asking how you see the connected histories of pandemics in the early modern world. I mean, you slightly mentioned in the beginning of your talk, but now it might be a good opportunity to elaborate further on the connected histories of pandemics.
Right, absolutely. In fact, that is the ultimate context to think about this. I try to emphasize, and in my written work and also here, it's all connected. It's all, taking place at the same time in different places, but it will not make sense of, focusing in one area without understanding how it connects to others. And disease is one way of, perhaps one of the best ways of studying these connected histories of how individuals in different locations and different societies were affected, but how their experience also had an impact on the experience of others. So I find it a very, very useful context to think about circulation of disease and impact of disease.
Mm-hmm. Nükhet, your first book was about late medieval and early modern era, and you finished sometime around the late 16th century, and now your current book project is expanding the scope, both thematically and chronologically. So this question posed by Gülveda Özgür might be relevant to your expanding interests. She's interested in to hear more about this Ottoman response to smallpox. In the later centuries, in the 18th century, that killed thousands. How the experience with new infectious diseases other than plague shaped the Ottoman responses to pandemics. Would you like to say a bit on that?
Right. I mean, I have to start by saying that, I have not looked at any specific records on smallpox in the Ottoman Empire. So what I know, again, just, from the secondary literature. But for smallpox, I think there is something that we need to keep in mind. In fact, perhaps in a way, this also relates to some of the other infectious diseases during the early modern period. We see the emergence of new infectious diseases in the early modern world, and also older diseases becoming more virulent. And smallpox is one of those. We used to think, until very recently, we used to think of smallpox as a very old disease, something that started in the Neolithic period. There's this whole question of the Ramesses and the ancient, Egyptian mummies showing signs of smallpox, and other earlier sources. But now new genetic studies basically suggesting that smallpox was not as virulent before the 16th or 17th centuries. It's one of those diseases that started becoming more virulent. So I think this should be the context for, studying smallpox in the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the most interesting aspect of this would be how folk treatments in the Ottoman Empire by inoculation, variolation, these methods kind of developed, as parts of folk wisdom being practiced by, at least according to our sources, some village women or wise women in the countryside. It's something that was typically done to children by taking samples of a sick child and transmitting to another, and how this knowledge was something that became widespread. And of course, as we know, the story of the lady Montague observing this being done in Istanbul and had it done for her own children. And, in her letters to England, this became, a matter of fascination for many members of the elite. And then later on, this knowledge, was expanded. So it's an interesting story, to think about, and the role of the Ottoman Empire. And, I think, again, I don't really know much about the impact of smallpox in the 18th century Ottoman Empire. That requires, I think, new research. But what we can say is that it was probably a more recent problem in the Ottoman Empire. 17th, 18th centuries becoming more virulent. But of course, I mean, we need new research about these different types of diseases affecting Ottoman society, and smallpox definitely a very dangerous one.
And several of our listeners posed the question, which is not a favorite of yours, question about the quarantine, the role of it, whether Ottomans came late to adopting quarantine measures. Would you like to say a few things about that obvious question?
Right. I mean, very quickly, I find it very, the discussion on the scholarship, historical scholarship about quarantine, the way it is talked about by historians of Ottoman Empire or historians of Europe, is kind of, creating this illusion or the sense in which quarantine is a sign of, or an icon of modernization, right, or a measure of civilization. That's the discussion that I find very limiting. In the Europeanist historiography, we see again this narrative of a very positivist narrative of progress, improvement of public health and sanitation, but using quarantines as a measure, as an icon of in this historiography. And on the Ottoman side, because of the implementation of quarantine measures in the Ottoman Empire starting in the 19th century, as a narrative of being late to modernity and kind of catching up to Europe. That's kind of the general discourse in which this is discussed. So I'm generally critical with this conversation on both sides. I think this is a misdirection in the historiography of positioning, implementation of quarantine as the golden standard of plague regulations. In fact, again, plague is a zoonotic illness that is not limited to humans. There is also a wider base, ecological base to study and understand the disease. And of course, it's a disease of rodents and other animals, and it is transmitted to humans by fleas. So quarantine measures will give you perhaps some sense of relief, but will not limit or will not stop or eradicate a disease like plague. And perhaps, other infectious diseases, it could have been more effective. I think what I'm trying to say, I am more critical of, thinking about the effectiveness of quarantine and taking it as the golden standard, if that makes sense.
If there is any particular question that you would like to address, you can also check. I believe you get the Q&A box. But some of our listeners are curious to hear more about, or for the first time, about the gender dimension of the disease, if there was any. I mean, we discussed the class dimension of experiencing plague pandemics back in the medieval and early modern eras. How about the gender dimension?
That's a good question, and I think we need to do more work on it. I can give a very limited answer to that question, again, not only for the Ottoman Empire, but also in the more developed field of European historiography. We have some engagement with the gender question, but limited. Part of the question is because, well, everyone died of plague. And it's very difficult to see if gender really played a role into, different rates of morbidity or mortality or how individuals were affected. But that said, definitely there's got to be some biological or social dimension, not only in terms of experience of disease and death, but also for the survivors. So that's really like a legitimately important and category to think about. What we know is that in terms of immunology and biology of women, they seem to die less than men in comparison because of iron levels in female bodies being lower historically than men, and because of how Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, can be transmitted in blood by iron molecules. So that's one piece of knowledge that we have. That said, when you look at bioarchaeological evidence, you have, men, women, and children, and people in all ages, dying as a result of disease. What I would like to know more about, and I don't, it would be great to have more studies of how women especially were affected by the disease when they lost their husbands or fathers or other male providers in the family, especially for the pre-modern Ottoman society, how they were affected as a result of this, in surviving this crisis, whether there were pensions or other forms of welfare or state support, economics, financial support provided to them in those contexts, and how, of course, children were affected, especially those that may have been left orphaned, and so thinking about the support mechanisms in society available to those individuals who were really disadvantaged as a result of epidemics. I mean, that would be an interesting area of research. And again, unfortunately, I haven't done this research and I can't answer that question, but it would be great if we had more.
And speaking of this genetic research, I mean, Nükhet, you are one of the pioneering experts in the field using that kind of knowledge coming from the genetic research and research in bioarchaeology. With that, and with this increased awareness, with this new reality of having to live with a disease for which there is no cure, where do you think the history of pandemic studies will lead in the next few years or a decade or so?
Right. I mean, I would call myself as a student of paleogenetics rather than an expert, but just trying to understand how we can think of historical sources in combination with bioarchaeological and paleogenetic sources is what I am trying to do. But where are we going in terms of historical scholarship and paleogenetics? It's an interesting question because we often have different types of questions, which is something I came to learn firsthand, collaborating with scientists and scholars working in other disciplines other than history. We don't necessarily ask the same questions. And what is interesting for a historian, for instance, I get like a very pressing question, will not necessarily be the ultimate research question for them. So it is kind of, in that sense, I think it's difficult to make a prediction outside of the historians' research areas. But in terms of our research agendas, I think this pandemic is really making us rethink what we thought we knew and how we should benefit from experiencing the pandemic to question our historical sources. At least, that would be the takeaway for me and anyone, I would say, working on history of epidemic diseases. And I'm delighted to see interest in the broader public about what we can gain from historical insights, right? Again, many of us as historians, we see that sometimes the public is looking into answers by looking into historical sources, but what is it really that we're trying to use history for? I mean, that's at least an interesting question to think about.
I think that's a very good way to conclude our webinar today, because we've come to the end of our time now. And Nükhet, thank you so much for all the wonderful insights you provided today. It's always a big pleasure to read your work and to speak with you on the importance of knowing these historical experiences in order to shed more accurate light to illuminate what we've been living through. So thank you so much again for your time, and thank you to all our listeners for watching us and posing their questions. We're sorry that we couldn't address each and every question posed in the Q&A box. And I would like to extend my thanks to Columbia Global Center Istanbul and Tunis for giving us this opportunity. Please stay tuned for more webinars offered by Columbia Global Center Istanbul and Tunis. And please stay safe. Okay.
Thank you.